It's my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Tara Brabazon from the University of Bolton. She's a widely published author. She brings experiences from Australia, from Canada, and the UK. She's now back in the UK. You were previously in the UK, and then you went away, and we've got you back now. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Tara Brabazon, who will be giving us our first keynote.
Thanks, Bridget. Most of us, when we explain what digitisation, the internet, the web, the read-write web have given to our lives, we tend to use verby nouns like efficiency, productivity, connectivity. But what's rarely mentioned is one of the causes of this efficiency is that elements of our daily life have been automated. So from Facebook telling us what we meant to feel like, from spelling checkers, the defragmentation of discs, and also Amazon predicting our shopping patterns, we move through life in a bubble of prediction where smartphones replace smart people. Think about your life right now. How often do you think about what you do not know? How often are you thrust into confusion? How often do you get panicked and worried that you don't understand what's going on? All the talk of efficiency and productivity means that we forget in our daily lives how often our lives are filled with tasks that 5, 10 or 15 years ago didn't actually exist. And most of these tasks, of course, are actually quite basic. We also normalise, rather than medicate, those guys and gals that just behave incredibly strangely, like those people who insist on sharing their cleverness when they write an email by CCing it to half of Yorkshire. You know those people. Like those workers and students, and indeed many members of this audience, who seem to be attached to their mobile phone as if it is an intravenous drip. You know what I'm saying? Like those users of Twitter who think they're being witty and funny and quirky and are actually being xenophobic, racist troll monsters. So there's a lot of flab to digitisation, and there's also a lot of problems that are caused or enabled or inflamed by it. Now, one of them is plagiarism. Now, I am old and incredibly close to death. I am 43 years of age, and when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I did my first degree at the University of Western Australia, and during the entirety of that degree, commencing in 1987, there was not a single mention of the word plagiarism. Computers were integral to my education, but there were whispers in the corridor about how academics were pinching the work of their undergraduates and graduate students. But compare this situation, ladies and gentlemen, to our present. Students work their guts out coming to university. Their parents suffer, don't they? They suffer to pay the fees required to get them to university. And when they arrive on their first day, their voice and eyes filled with joy. What do we do with them? Yes, within an hour of their arrival, we crush their little hopes. We start to metaphorically and sometimes physically hit them over the head with the stick of plagiarism. And I see, as I sit in the back of those induction sessions, the joy, the happiness, the thrill, the motivation, the passion, the imagination, everything just drain from their little faces. We never think that maybe, just maybe, we're actually causing the problem that we most fear by replacing teaching and learning with blaming and shaming. Part of this story that I'm talking about today continues the post-Google automation of computing. Students are told in that first session that Turnitin will discover plagiarism. Whether it is intentional or unintentional, we're going to destroy you. We're going to take your small intestine and we're going to just put them around the quadrangle. You're going to die. Yeah. So what they're told is an automated widget is inserted into Moodle and they will be discovered. So Turnitin is the panopticon of plagiarism. It certainly manages plagiarism. It certainly censors the plagiarists. But are we missing a part of this story, ladies and gentlemen? Are we indeed missing the story? In the last 25 years or so, plagiarism has moved from invisible in our degree programs to the scholarly crime of our intellectual culture. And indeed, every era finds a folk devil that suits it. In the 20th century, we moved from flaneurs to feminists. We moved from rock and roll to rap. And isn't it? It's always easier to construct a label and then throw all the badness, all the evilness, all the problems of the culture in that label, and then attack a group that doesn't have enough power to fight back. Stuart Hall and others described this as policing the crisis. Youth is one of those labels that police the crisis. Internet plagiarism is another one that polices the crisis, and so is internet pornography, which of course none of you do. Part of the agenda of this presentation today, therefore, is to ask you all, what are we not talking about when we summon the folk devil of plagiarism? What is being hidden? What is being masked? And why are plagiarists the folk devils of our time? I offer an argument for your consideration. With all the great benefits of digitisation, the internet and the World Wide Web, look at what we've chosen to do with our time. We search rather than research, and we shop rather than think. But instead of putting that damn phone away and switching off Facebook so you can actually look in the mirror and see what you've actually become, we displace, we label, we judge young people, as youth have always been labelled and judged, but instead of ridiculing them for the length of their hair or the loudness of their rock music, instead we abuse them for how they enact behaviour online. So what we're doing is we're displacing attacks on our beautiful libraries and our librarians that politicians around the world have decided that they can close and sack librarians. So we're displacing that conversation. We're also displacing an attack on the politicians who are pretty well destroying our schools and universities. Today, therefore, I take a step back from automation, of nodding in agreement, of silent compromise, which those that try to transform our schools and universities into prisons for the next generations of scholars. I argue that plagiarism is a proxy, a strategy to blame the victim rather than consider what has actually happened to higher education in the last 20 years or so. We are now, aren't we, living with the consequences of cheap and quick fixes for the last 20 years. That's a drug deal well done for 9 o'clock in the morning. But most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, once we answer that, I'll have half a tonne of crack cocaine. Thanks very much. But most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summon a positivity to today's. We could just get depressed and just go to the bar. Or no, I can very quickly give you 10 positive strategies about how we actually medicate, we heal, and we solve some of the wider problems in higher education. So I have 10 strategies. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
My name is Tara. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. That's much better, darling. So are you ready for 10 quick things to talk about? Yes?
Yes.
Darlings, here is our first one. I love you all. While software discovers plagiarism, the greater question that we raised through much of yesterday, which was just brilliant, is how plagiarism is actually prevented. It's much easier to pay for a widget that has access to an application and a database than it is to actually think about how to prevent it in the first place. The solution to plagiarism, ladies and gentlemen, is not software, it is information literacy. This is enacted through assessment instruments. We need to find ways to create a scaffold, to create a ladder to effective assessment, rather than hide behind in-class tests and hide behind end-of-semester examinations. The number one strategy I use to deploy an information scaffold is to create small, interesting scaffolding assessments like annotated bibliographies or research proposals. So this is great. A research proposal due very early in the semester, about 100, 200 words in length, means the students learn how to write an abstract, but any problem that we pick up is picked up early in a small piece of work. I've also now constructed a very, very sharp annotated bibliography for students to explore. I ask that they find 20 sources of different types, separated by mode, modality, and indeed media. But students have difficulty finding these types of sources. So for example, here's a student within 1 month of graduating after a 4-year degree in Canada. 1 month to graduation. The problem, therefore, is not the search engine, ladies and gentlemen. The problem is a lack of information literacy. But the idea that a student hadn't had to find sources like this for 4 years is rather startling, is it not? And yes, of course, as always happens, this problem gets worse. 1 week before the assignment was due, I received this email. So within 4 weeks of graduation, this student needed help in finding a book and a refereed article. Okay. 2, I have a theory. There's an inverse relationship between the number of institutional surveys about feedback and the quality of the feedback that the students actually receive. The online submission through online management systems is being confirmed and staunchly protected by our academic managers. But the question is, ladies and gentlemen, why? The key justification to online submissions rather than analogue or paper-based submissions is, of course, it can be run through Turnitin. Examining scripts, though, on paper compared to examining scripts on a screen, though, result in different types of feedback. And it's interesting, no one really talks about that. At its most basic, ladies and gentlemen, a screen is a different shape from a piece of paper. So therefore, a piece of paper enables us to assess paragraph construction and the flow and development of ideas. But as has been researched through a series of JISC studies, the screen encourages superficial reading. Our eyes literally glaze over the surface of the shiny object in front of us. There's no discussion, though, is there, about how the mode and the quality of feedback transforms as we move from paper to screen. My students, however, were not so reticent. This was, of course, a fourth-year student who had just graduated from a laptop university. She had been assessed by Turnitin, an online submission, for 4 years. Notice she's arguing that she had received very little feedback for her work. Indeed, the Turnitin report was starting to replace the feedback she wanted to receive. Oops. Now, that's not the fault of Turnitin. It's absolutely the fault of how it has been used. It is a lack of professional development from staff to understand the difference between compliance in plagiarism protocols and our students receiving feedback. 3, the impact of online submission for a generation of students, guys and girls, is starting to become pretty clear. I taught a large survey course last year titled Introduction to Communication. I still hand mark each paper. It takes me about an hour to do each paper, and I write an A4 typed commentary in response to every single paper. I've done this since I started marking in 1991, and I still believe in it. I've always believed it's valuable because students improve quickly when the feedback is individualised and customised. Now, I've never doubted the value of this type of feedback until Christmas 2011. I marked 161 papers that were due by the institutional forum, and the marks were due on the 2nd of January. So I marked through Christmas Eve, I marked through Christmas Day, I marked through New Year's Eve, I marked through New Year's Day. I didn't go to Australia to see my parents because I didn't have time, and like my father's 83, he's going to be dead soon, this is going to be really bad. But those 161 papers got marked to a standard that I expect of myself, and on the 2nd of January, I submitted those grades to that forum, did it, fantastic, whoo, yeah. On the 3rd of January, which happens to be my birthday, I went into work to hand back those 161 assignments that took 161 hours of Christmas to mark. 3rd of January. I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. Of the 161 papers, only 4 students picked up their assignments, and the rest were pulped in the April of this year. Because the students had received the mark they had received online, they didn't bother actually picking up their feedback. And that meant, ladies and gentlemen, they had no algorithm or mechanism through which to improve. This is what we have created. We have created a dumbed down marking structure and reduced the value of all marking to the mark. David, of course, used that evocative phrase behind me when he said, "It feels like a machine is marking my work." So look at the student culture we've created. online submission, standardised grade forms, the saints preserve us, and online marks. So students can now avoid receiving feedback through the entirety of their degree, semester after semester, submitting the same old nonsense. As I've always argued, ladies and gentlemen, the starting point of learning is to know what you do not know. But if students don't even receive their feedback, then how are they going to gain that moment of consciousness to know what they don't know? We therefore need a solution to force students to get their feedback, to force them to see the strengths and the weaknesses of their scholarship. This is what I call meta-assessment. Now, I use cascading assessment that I'll talk about in a sec, where all the assessment is tethered and linked and leads to a big final project. But this cascading method falls apart if students don't actually pick up their feedback because the cascade freezes. So what are we going to do? To re-energise that moment of reflection in a student's portfolio, it's necessary that I follow the advice that my old teacher trainer gave me in 1991. Tara, if you want them to learn it, put bloody marks behind it. Okay. So what I've done is I've created a meta-assessment that's worth 10% of the semester's mark. And what happens is they receive their first assignment and then have to write a second assignment explaining what feedback they received, their weaknesses, their strengths, and how they're going to improve next time. So they have to demonstrate expertise in their own feedback, and that then enables the development of the scaffold. For a range of research projects have shown that no matter how much all of us as librarians and teachers put into those learning management systems, the hours upon hours of rich, open educational resources, students simply use them to download our lecture slides, don't they? Therefore, there are two key problems that are emerging here, guys. Got it. Firstly, students do not learn how to take lecture notes independently. Remember, downloading somebody else's notes is not the same as taking your own. Also, it means in a lecture theatre, if they know that they can download the PowerPoint slides, they can, excuse my language, piss about in the lecture theatre. So they can be on Facebook, they can take a drug deal phone call in the middle of a lecture, it's brilliant. So they can basically piss about, okay, because they know that the lecturer's slides are going to be there so they can have a nice time. They'll think that they'll get enough to be able to pass through those PowerPoint slides. Therefore, though, they don't gain auditory literacies. They don't gain the capacity to understand their sonic environment and take notes. Downloading other people's notes is different from taking your own. But a second problem is emerging. We all know students are conducting very little reading. One of the reasons they're conducting very little reading is they're confusing the reading of PowerPoint slides with the reading of scholarship. So therefore, this is one of the key causes of plagiarism. They're not reading enough, so therefore it's almost inevitable that they're going to nick something because that's all they've read. Even more importantly, though, academic slides are simply being downloaded when assignments and examinations are pending. So what do? I don't upload my lecture PowerPoint slides. I do something very naughty. At the start of the semester, I upload a series of files that I give interesting names like Lecture 1 Base Notes, Lecture 2 Base Notes. So the key is in the title. The students don't go, "You're being really lazy because you haven't given me notes." They've got notes for the lecture, but instead of the 80 or 90 slides that I actually use in a lecture and a workshop, I give them about 6 to 8 slides. The PowerPoints I give them are in an integrated package that is actually distinct from the lectures, so they simply can't cut and paste. The function, therefore, is to create an orientation package into that week's reading. So we're changing the function of the uploaded and downloaded PowerPoint slides. So it's not about cheat sheets or being slack, it's about orientation in a new type of sensory learning environment. Number 5, we're there. You okay? Go back to that last slide. Oh, darling.
You'll be able to download it later.
The great thing is she won't. But darling, I will send it to you, I promise. 5. Cascading assessment is very important. It is really, for me, the way in which we handle a whole series of problems that are emerging in higher education. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, and let's just call a spade a bloody shovel, as we'd say in Australia, the truth is this. I have seen a debilitating decline in academic standards in the last 20 years. Full bloody stop. Now, I've worked in 4 countries, which means I have the uncomfortable but predictable privilege of being able to compare international standards for scholarship. Hello. So, for example, when I left Murdoch University, I was teaching a large first-year survey course titled Creative Industries, first-year course. 6 weeks later, I was teaching a third-year course at the University of Brighton, first semester, third year. And the standard of the students was lower than the standard of the first-year students in Australia. I then went to Canada, and I was teaching 4th-year students, and you can imagine what's happening here. They had so little knowledge of communication that the knowledge I could expect at the end of first year in the United Kingdom was not present in these students. So what had happened in Canada? Well, very little quality assurance, a lot of what we wouldn't recognise as quality assurance, and most importantly, I think, a lack of benchmarking for each year of a degree. What should students attain at the end of first, second, third, fourth? But other problems emerged as well. No tutorials or seminars, a lack of feedback for students, very old textbooks, a lack of teaching time, but most importantly, a lack of professional development from the academics. None of the academics had any teaching qualifications, and the impact of that was pretty clear. Firstly, they poorly constituted assessment. There were too many, for example, online quizzes. Far too many lecture times that were filled by mid-semester exams or end-of-year exam, but also their study guides, which they called syllabi, although they weren't really. Their syllabi were 8 pages in length, mostly 6, but 8 as well. But of those 6 to 8 pages, 4 pages talked about plagiarism and how Turnitin would be used against them. Okay, so obviously the staff had created the very plagiarism problem that they most feared by actually teaching very little content to assess. Now, this is obviously not just my personal experience. A great book from Aram and Rosker that I refer to a lot is titled Academically Adrift. And these guys constructed a longitudinal study of North American degree qualifications. And guys and gals, what they did was this. They tested students as they arrived at university, tested students as they left university, and found that actually they didn't learn very much in between. But then the authors enact a knight's move, and it is a productive one. Blame for educational achievement was not loaded onto the students, but onto the staff. That we did not have enough motivation, inspiration, or effort placed into getting that content into those students. So there is a way to interrupt and intervene in this process, and that's what I call cascading assessment. This is particularly useful for those of us who are teaching in universities, part of the widening participation agenda respect, who are teaching in universities where, in all conscience, we maybe can't give those students degrees. You know what I'm saying? Yeah? So the cascade creates a level of student engagement, guys, whereby we can actually see where the students are, give them an assessment, lift them, go in, lift. So a series of interventions. To provide one example of this cascading assessment that I wrote with my husband, hi Steve, Professor Steve Redhead. This module was again in Canada, 4th year. It was called an Interdisciplinary Legal Project. Now guys, again, law is very complicated in terms of plagiarism, bless. But what happened was, in 4th year, the students were being asked, in effect, to write a dissertation, but they'd read nothing except very basic legal textbooks, so they couldn't actually manage it. So what Steve and I developed was as follows. That's the cascade, a 4-tier series of assessments. All the assignments were tethered so that the students would receive continual feedback. Know where they are, get a boost up. Know where they are, get a boost up. Errors are picked up early. Now, this is obviously incredibly hard on staff. Feedback must be quick, it must be rigorous, and you've really got to care for these students. But it means students cannot replicate the old not reading much, not editing much, not writing much. They have to organise their time. Number 6. Here we go. There's a very large literature about higher education at the moment that has the word crisis in the title. But clearly, guys and gals, when we create a culture of crisis, we also create a culture of compliance to medicate it. Compliance culture is inappropriate for all forms of education, but particularly higher education. The treatment of students as clients who we serve and facilitate is going to cause us profound trouble in the next 3 years or so. The question is, for all of you, where do our students find the inspiration and the motivation to be the best that they can be? Where do they find that excitement, that passion that brought so much of us and so many of us to education? The time has come, therefore, to find that great care and that great respect in those opening induction and orientation programs. They need to be exciting events rather than tick-a-box exercises. We have to keep that joy, that transcendence of what the best of higher education can give. 7. Students have become consumers of education, and the example of the statement I just gave there is the textbook market. I'm going to tell you a story that was told to me by one of the major editors of one of the major publishing houses of textbooks on this planet. I was writing a textbook for them, wrote the proposal, went out to referees, the referees loved it, it was all going well. Then the editor said to me, "Tara, the book's just too difficult." He made a statement with a racial slur in it, which I will remove, but he stated to me, quote, "Tara, the audience for a textbook is a 19-year-old girl who's more interested in her boyfriend than learning anything." Now, this is offensive, darlings, on many levels. It's offensive about students, about learning, about women, and why it's important is not so much that it's honest, because I don't think it is, but I think it's a warning that we have to take seriously. It's not good enough. Aram and Rosker have argued very strongly that we need to increase and enhance the learning that's happening in universities. And we all know, of course, Turnitin discovers the errors that are in its database, and it finds them very easily if everybody's assigning the same old crap textbooks around the world, doesn't it? Fabulous. So why I get really cross on students' behalf is, instead of buying this low-grade dated nonsense, it's never been easier to actually have high-quality material given to them. Why should we be tethering their learning to a textbook when the open access movement is creating an extremely high-quality range of materials? Here we go, 8. Besides making reading more complex, it's important that we actually make our assignments tougher, so they actually assess some stuff. The key, therefore, in terms of plagiarism, is not to encourage a culture of paraphrasing, but find assignments through artefacts and exegeses, through the Web 2 environment, that encourage originality, creativity, imagination. So Colin, one of my delightful students in Canada, really told the truth about what he thinks about higher education. And why he's right is, let me tell you about 2 courses that every single year for the 6 years I was at the university, these 2 courses presented 1/2 to 2/3 of the students in that class before an academic misconduct meeting. These cases had nothing to do with the students and everything to do with the assessment that they'd been assigned. I will tell you it quickly. The first one was a first-year film course where the students were asked to retell the plot of a classic cinema text. The second assignment, and they wonder why media studies has got a bad reputation, talk to the hand. The second case where this was very, very common was a third-year research methods course where students were asked to paraphrase a book chapter on a particular method. Now, is it any wonder with such crap assessment that those students would actually be before a disciplinary meeting? No. There are innovative options that are now available. We need to go there. 9. Culturally and historically, that which is faster dominates that which is slower. The impact of that argument is that writing and thinking is being replaced by scrolling and skimming. We know that. This change is not caused by the students, but it is caused by a lack of information and media literacy. It doesn't have to be this way. For example, respect to all my Australians and Kiwis in the room, the University of Wollongong Library and Librarians in Australia has Start Smart, great title, which by the librarians and libraries at the University of Wollongong is a compulsory information literacy course for all undergraduates. Unless the students complete this course, their marks are withheld, nay, indefinitely. So from the start of a student's degree, it means that libraries and librarians are the core of the work that they are doing, the cranium of the culture, as I've often called librarians. So we have a choice. We can create a culture of compliance and grievance, or motivation and excitement. And yes, you've been waiting for this. Where are we?
Number 10.
Thank you, darling. Love you so much. Very handsome boy. Many of the initiatives, he's gorgeous. I love him a lot. If I wasn't married, you'd be in deep trouble at this conference. Many of the initiatives that I've talked about so far in this keynote, you gorgeous boy, are not demeaning or ridiculing or attacking students, but they're actually questioning the behaviour of staff. And I've done that intentionally. It's very easy to blame students, particularly at the moment. And as Angela Carter has argued, there are really so many different types of plagiarism, and each of them have different causes, and each of them have different outcomes. And then we get to the gorgeous Edward Winter, of course, who has that fantastic definition of self-plagiarism. Gorgeous Trace. The definition of self-plagiarism and citation is not as precise, of course, as our software evangelist administrators may wish. Similarly, there is that messy and complicated issue of senior academics claiming the work of their research assistants and PhD students. This claiming or appropriating the work of subordinates could actually be called institutional plagiarism. And if students have seen senior academics appropriate the work of younger, more inexperienced and less powerful scholars, what lesson are our students learning about academic integrity? Plagiarism is multiphasal, it's multi-causal. But as I've argued throughout this keynote, we need to demand more of students, but we need to demand more of academics as well. I believe, and this is going to get me into trouble, I'm always in trouble, but I believe this, okay, I'm just calling a spade a shovel again, I'm just putting it out there. I believe every academic should hold two things. We should hold a doctorate, which demonstrates a competency in content, but we should also hold a diploma or a bachelor in teaching, in learning, in education, because that confirms a competence, ability in form. I can always tell a teacher who's unable to manage form and content. You know why? Because they fill tutorials and indeed lectures with student presentations. We all know the truth, don't we, that they're using presentations because they either can't be bothered or are not skilled enough to actually develop anything more interesting in terms of learning. I can give you an example of this. As you know, I've just returned from Canada, and I returned from a laptop university, and the laptop became the excuse to reduce student contact. I always remember that breathtaking moment when I sent the email to the administrator saying, "Thank you so much for telling me when my 3-hour lecture is. When are the seminars and the tutorials for the 161 first-year students?" And he replied, "No, there are no seminars or tutorials. They have a laptop. That's all they need." Now, I'm a pretty experienced teacher. I've won a lot of teaching awards. I know all the tricks of technology in the trade. But let me tell you something. Those 3-hour lectures were the toughest teaching I've ever done in a barn of a room, Wi-Fi'd students. It was extraordinary. My dress was just soaked by the end of those 3-hour lectures. I got the highest teaching reviews of my life, God knows how. But a byproduct of this process was that I decided to come in 3 hours early before the lecture so the students could at least see me while they were on campus, bless them. But the byproduct of that was I got to see the academic in the room before me and what he did in the 3 hours. So for the first 2 weeks, he did a 1-hour lecture in the 3-hour slot and let him go. For the remaining 11 weeks of the course, he did student presentations via PowerPoint. Week after week, these poor, sweaty little students arrived to a darkened auditorium with one of those damn pointers, doing the bouncing ball with the laser pointer, reading every single bloody word on those bloody slides. This went on week after week after week after week, and by the final week, week 13, there were more students on the stage delivering than in the audience. These students may not have plagiarised content, but the bigger question remains, how much did they actually learn? Turnitin is a gastric band for plagiarism. It may stop it, but the question remains, how much do our students learn when it does? Thank you all. Thank you for your time.